The bridge of the Valiant hummed with the quiet efficiency of a well-trained crew going about their routine patrol duties in the outer reaches of human space, where the stars seemed cold and distant against the black void. Captain Jake Morrison sat in his command chair reviewing the daily reports when the communications console erupted, with a harsh electronic screech that made everyone on the bridge wince and turn toward the source of the disturbance. Lieutenant Sophie Grant moved her hands across her console with practiced speed, while her face showed the concentration of someone trying to make sense of corrupted data flowing through multiple channels at once. Jake stood and walked closer to her station as the rest of the bridge crew fell silent and watched their communications officer work to clean up whatever signal had just burst through their receivers with such urgency. Sophie finally looked up with worry clear in her eyes and nodded to indicate she had something they needed to hear right away. The message that played through the bridge speakers was translated by their computer systems, but the fear in the original voice needed no translation as it came through in every syllable and desperate breath. This is the merchant vessel Bright Wing of the Pelin Republic, and we are under attack by Corsath raiders who are tearing through our shields and hull like we are made of paper, and our weapon systems were never designed for this kind of assault. Mbebrio, voice continued with barely controlled panic, making it crack and break as the speaker fought to get the words out, while explosions could be heard in the background, along with screams and the sound of metal being torn apart. We have civilians aboard, including women and children and elderly passengers who came on this voyage thinking it would be safe. But now we are dying and our shields are failing and hull breaches are opening on multiple decks. Please, anyone who can hear this message, we need help desperately, and we are transmitting our coordinates in the hope that someone will come before it is too late for all of us. The message dissolved into static and then began repeating from the beginning in an endless loop that seemed to echo the hopelessness of the situation. Jake turned to his tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander Ryan Phillips, who was already pulling up the coordinates and running calculations on his display. Ryan looked up and his jaw was tight as he delivered the information that Jake both wanted and dreaded to hear about their ability to respond to this crisis. 4 hours at maximum burn, Captain. But those coordinates put them in neutral space, which technically falls outside our designated patrol zone according to current fleet regulations. Jake felt something cold and hard settle in his chest as he thought about children dying in the cold vacuum of space, while bureaucrats worried about whose jurisdiction they fell under. Sophie sent a priority message to Fleet Command and informed them we are responding to a distress call, and Ryan plot the fastest possible course and engage our quantum drive at full military power. Immediately, Ryan hesitated for just a moment because regulations required authorization for crossing into neutral space, but one look at his captain's face told him this was not the time to quote the rule book. Sir, the regulations state that we need to wait for authorization before entering neutral space, and if we proceed without approval, there could be consequences when we return. Jake's voice cut through the bridge like a knife with an edge that everyone recognized as the tone their captain used when his mind was absolutely made up, and no argument would change it. There are children on that ship, Ryan, and children do not care about patrol zones or regulations or consequences, so plot the course now, and that is a direct order. The crew moved with the efficiency that came from months of training together, and within minutes the Valiant's powerful engines came to life with a deep thrumming that could be felt through the deck plates. The stars visible through the main viewport stretched into brilliant streaks of light as the ship jumped to quantum speed and began eating up the distance between them and the dying merchant vessel. Ensign Katie Webb, who was the youngest member of the bridge crew, looked up from her sensor station with concern written across her features as she monitored the distress signal. Captain, I am picking up the automated distress beacon now, but the signal strength is definitely getting weaker with each passing minute, and I do not think they have much time left. Jake opened a channel to engineering where Chief Engineer Alex Turner and his team were already working to squeeze every bit of performance from the ship's drive systems. Alex, I need every ounce of speed you can possibly give me. And if that means diverting power from non-essential systems, then do it without hesitation, because lives depend on us getting there. Fast, Alex's voice came back through the comm system with the confidence of an engineer who knew his ship inside and out and understood exactly what she could handle. Already on it. Captain, and I am pushing. the quantum drives to 110% of their rated capacity, and she will hold together. But I cannot promise for how long at this level. Just get us there, Alex, and worry about the rest later, because right now speed is the only thing that matters. The bridge fell into a tense silence broken only by the quiet beeping of consoles and the occasional update from crew members monitoring various systems and sensor readings. Sophie continued analyzing the distress signal and pulling up every bit of information she could find about the Pellans and their usual ship configurations and defensive capabilities. Captain, I have been researching the Pellans, and they are a peaceful species who focus primarily on trade and commerce throughout this sector, and they do not maintain military vessels. Their ships have basic defensive shields meant to protect against space debris and micrometeorites, but nothing that could stand up to a coordinated military assault by raiders. Jake felt his hands curl into fists at his sides as he imagined what those peaceful merchants must be going through right now, at the hands of pirates who saw them as easy prey. Ryan pulled up tactical files on the Corsath, and what he found made the situation even more grim than they had initially thought. The Corsath are known pirates and slavers who operate in pack formations targeting civilian vessels. Because they know those ships cannot fight back effectively, they take whatever cargo they want and often capture civilians to sell as slaves on black market worlds, where such practices still exist despite galactic laws against it. This sector has seen increased Corsath activity over the past 6 months, and the local governments have not been able to stop them or even slow them down significantly. Jake stared at the viewport where the stars continued their endless dance as streaks of light, while his mind worked through tactical scenarios and possible approaches to the situation. Those Corsath pirates have not encountered us yet, and they are about to learn a very hard lesson about what happens when they attack innocent civilians, while humans are in the neighborhood. The crew exchanged glances around the bridge, and there was a grim determination settling over all of them as they prepared for what was coming. They had trained for combat scenarios and run countless drills, but this would be different, because this time there were real lives hanging in the balance and real consequences if they failed. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness as the Valiant raced through space at speeds that would have seemed impossible just a few generations earlier when humanity was still confined to Earth. Jake remained, standing near the center of the bridge because sitting felt wrong when there were people dying who were counting on him and his crew to arrive in time to save them. Katie continued monitoring the distress beacon, and every time it flickered or weakened, she would report it with growing concern in her voice. 3 hours and 40 minutes until we reach the coordinates, Captain, and the beacon is still transmitting. But it is definitely getting weaker. Jake acknowledged her report with a nod while his mind raced through everything that could go wrong and everything they would need to do right when they arrived at the scene. The Valiant was a powerful ship with weapons and defenses that represented the best of human military engineering, but they would be going into an unknown situation against an enemy that was already engaged in combat. Ryan began running tactical simulations on his console, trying to predict what they might find and what strategies would give them the best chance of success. Sophie maintained contact with Fleet Command and relayed updates about their progress, while also monitoring all communication channels in case the Bright Wing sent any new messages. The whole ship had taken on the feel of a coiled spring ready to release all its energy the moment they dropped out of quantum drive and faced whatever waited for them at those coordinates. Jake thought about the voice they had heard on that distress call and the fear and desperation that had filled every word, and he made a silent promise that they would not arrive too late. The Corsath raiders were about to discover that humanity did not ignore distress calls and did not calculate the cost before responding to cries for help. They were about to learn that humans took these things personally. 3 hours and 42 minutes after receiving the distress call, the Valiant dropped out of quantum drive at the edge of what could only be described as a scene from a nightmare. Katie Webb's voice came out as barely more than a whisper as she stared at her sensor display and tried to process what she was seeing. "Oh God, Captain, you need to see this." The Bright Wing hung in space like a broken toy that had been smashed by an angry child who did not care about the delicate mechanisms inside hull. Plates were peeled back like flower petals, exposing the internal compartments to the killing vacuum of space, where nothing living could survive for more than a few seconds. Atmosphere vented from dozens of breaches, creating plumes of frozen crystals. That caught the light from the distant star and turned the scene into something almost beautiful, if you did not think about what it meant. 3 Korsath raider ships circled the dying merchant vessel like predators who were not satisfied with just killing their prey, but wanted to torture it first. Their weapons continued firing into the wreckage, sending bright flashes of energy, cutting through what remained of the Brightwing's structure. Sophie worked her console with frantic speed, trying to scan for survivors, and when she looked up, her face was pale but determined. "Life signs are faint, but I am reading survivors, Captain. And they have retreated to the central compartments where the hull is still intact." Her voice dropped to something harder and angrier as she continued her report. "Captain, the Korsath are deliberately targeting the refugee sections where the civilians would have gathered, and they are systematically executing the survivors." The bridge fell into a silence so complete that the only sound was the quiet hum of the ship's systems and the breathing of the crew, who were all processing what they had just heard. Every human on the bridge understood with perfect clarity that what they were witnessing was not combat between military forces, but simple cold-blooded murder of defenseless civilians. Jake's voice when he spoke was cold enough to freeze helium and carried an edge that his crew had never heard before. "Battle stations, and I want all weapons hot, right? Now, and Ryan, target the raider ship that is closest to the Brightwing. And Sophie, open a communication channel." The Valiant came alive as combat systems engaged and targeting solutions were calculated, and weapons arrays swiveled to track the enemy. Vessels, the Korsath ships, detected the human vessel and began turning away from their victim to face this new threat that had appeared without warning. Their weapon arrays started moving to target the Valiant as they prepared to deal with what they probably thought was just another merchant vessel that had made the mistake of responding to the distress call. Sophie looked up and nodded to indicate the channel was open, and Jake leaned forward in his command chair. "Korsath vessels, this is Captain Jake Morrison of the Earth Defense Force ship Valiant, and you will power down your weapons and withdraw immediately, or we will open fire." The response came in broken standard language as the translator struggled to convert the harsh, guttural sounds of the Korsath language into something humans could understand. "Human vessel, this not your concern, and you leave now or you share their fate." Jake smiled, but there was absolutely no warmth or humor in it, and his eyes were as cold as the space surrounding them. "Wrong answer. And Ryan, you may fire at will." The Valiant's railguns fired first, and tungsten penetrators crossed the distance between the ships in a handful of seconds, moving so fast they were essentially invisible. The kinetic rounds slammed into the lead Korsath ship's shields with the force of small asteroids, and the defensive screens flared brilliant blue before collapsing completely under the assault. The second volley punched through the now unprotected hull like it was made of tissue paper and found the reactor core buried deep in the ship's center. The Raider's reactor went critical, and the resulting explosion lit up the darkness of space like a miniature sun being born and dying in the same instant. The remaining 2 Korsath ships scattered in different directions as their captains suddenly realized they were not facing another helpless merchant, but a fully armed military vessel. But the Valiant was already moving with a speed and precision that spoke of hundreds of hours of combat drills and a crew that worked together like a single organism. Point defense lasers tracked and destroyed incoming missiles, while the main guns continued their devastating work against the pirates who had thought this would be another easy target. Katie called out fire control solutions in a steady voice that showed she had pushed past her initial shock and was now focused entirely on her job, second target locked and tracking. Captain Ryan coordinated the attack with the calm efficiency of someone who had trained for exactly this moment. His entire career. Firing now. The second raider tried desperately to escape by engaging its quantum drive, but that required precious seconds of charging time that it simply did not have. The Valiant's tactical systems were faster, and a spread of missiles caught the fleeing ship just as its drive began to spool up for the jump. The resulting cascade failure as the quantum drive exploded tore the vessel apart from the inside, outscattering debris across several thousand kilometers of space. The last Korsath ship fought back with everything it had, unleashing a desperate barrage of energy weapons and kinetic rounds that hammered against the Valiant's shield's energy beams, scorched across the defensive screens, making them flare and shimmer, while solid projectiles slammed into the reinforced armor plating with impacts that could be felt through the deck. But the human ship pressed forward, absorbing the punishment. Like a boxer walking through jabs to land the knockout blow, the Valiant returned fire with methodical precision, targeting weapon systems first, then engines, then any system that might allow the raider to escape or continue fighting. Ryan monitored, the damage assessments flowing across his tactical display, and reported with satisfaction. Their shields are down, Captain, and all weapon systems have been destroyed, and their engines are offline, and they are dead in space. Jake stood, and his voice, carried clearly across the bridge, Sophie hailed them. When the communication channel opened, Jake's words were chosen carefully because he wanted them to be remembered and repeated. This is your only warning, and I want you to spread the word among your kind that if we catch you attacking civilian vessels again, there will be no mercy and no negotiations and no survivors. He paused to let that sink in before continuing. Are we perfectly clear? The Korsath captain's response was filled with venom. But there was an unmistakable undertone of fear that had not been there before. You have made enemy of Korsath clans human, and we will remember this. Jake's voice dropped to something soft and dangerous. Good, and you make absolutely sure that you do remember, and now get out of my sight before I change my mind about letting you live. The crippled raider limped away into the darkness, using whatever auxiliary power it had left to put distance between itself and the human ship that had just destroyed its companions. Jake turned to face his crew, and the battle fury began to drain from his expression as he shifted from combat mode to rescue operations. Sophie, get me a direct line to the Bright Wing if they can still receive, and Katie, prep all our shuttles for immediate rescue operations, and Ryan, maintain full combat readiness in case those pirates decide to come back with reinforcements. The crew moved with renewed purpose as they transitioned from the adrenaline of combat to the equally important work of saving whatever lives they could from the wreckage floating before them. Jake stared at the broken hull of the Bright Wing and wondered how many of those distress call voices were still alive and whether they had arrived in time to make a difference. He had kept his promise to come, but the real test would be whether he could keep the promise to save them. Commander Lisa Chen led her rescue team through the twisted corridors of the Bright Wing, where every surface told a story of violence and terror. The air was thick with smoke, and the acrid smell of burned electronics mixed with something worse that Lisa tried not to think about too much. Her medical team moved carefully through the wreckage, working frantically to stabilize survivors and prepare them for transport back to the Valiant, where proper medical facilities waited. The Pellans were small creatures barely reaching Lisa's chest, with delicate features and large, luminous eyes that seemed too big for their faces. They reminded Lisa of the deer she had seen as a child growing up in Montana, with that same quality of gentleness and vulnerability that made you want to protect them. But now those beautiful eyes were wide with terror and shock as they stared at the humans who had come to save them. Corpsman Danny Price called out from deeper in the wreckage where he had been checking. Compartments for survivors, Commander, over here, and you need to see this right away. Lisa followed his voice through a corridor that had been partially crushed by the impact of weapons fire until she reached a section where a bulkhead had collapsed. Group of Pellan children huddled together in the corner of what had once been some kind of common area, and they were clutching each other with desperate strength. Their caretaker lay nearby, and she was an elderly Pellan female who had clearly used her own body to shield the children from the worst of the damage. She was badly injured with burns and impact trauma visible even through her clothing, but her eyes were still open, and aware Lisa knelt beside the elderly Pellan and pulled out her medical scanner while keeping her movements slow and gentle so as not to frighten the already traumatized survivors. Easy now, and we are here to help you. And can you understand what I am saying? The elderly Pellan's translator device was damaged, but it flickered to life with a crackling sound before her words came through in accented but understandable English. You came, and we thought no one would come because we sent the distress call hours ago, and the council told us that humans were dangerous and unpredictable and should be avoided. But you came anyway. Lisa felt something twist in her chest as she began administering pain medication and scanning for internal injuries. Of course we came, and when we heard there were people in danger, we did not even think twice about it. She turned to Danny, who was already moving to help. Help me stabilize her for transport, and kids, can any of you walk? Because we need to get all of you to our ship where you will be safe. The Pelin children stared at the human rescue team with expressions that mixed fear with desperate hope in equal measures. They had clearly been taught that humans were predators from a death world, and everything about the rescue team probably confirmed that at first glance. The humans were tall and heavily built compared to the delicate Pelins, and they moved with the confident grace of creatures who had evolved to hunt. Slowly, one of the children reached out with a trembling hand and touched Lisa's gloved fingers, as if testing whether she was real. The child's voice was barely audible even in the quiet of the damaged compartment. "You are not going to hurt us." Lisa felt her heart break into pieces as she realized what these children had been through and what they must have expected when armed soldiers came through the door. "Never, and I promise you that on everything I hold sacred. And now come on and let us get you somewhere safe and warm." Over the next 4 hours, the Valiant's crew worked without rest or pause as they pulled survivors from every intact section of the shattered merchant vessel. They cut through collapsed bulkheads and bypassed damaged systems and carried injured Pelins through corridors that were never designed for creatures of human size. In the end, they recovered 143 survivors from what had been a ship carrying over 300 souls when it left port. Dr. Helen Brooks and her medical team transformed the Valiant's cargo bay into an emergency triage center that would have done any planet-side hospital proud. They treated injuries ranging from minor cuts and bruises to critical trauma that required immediate surgery to save lives that hung by threads. Jake walked through the makeshift medical bay, stopping to speak with survivors when they were conscious enough to communicate. Many of them flinched when he approached because these gentle beings were simply not accustomed to being near predator species, especially ones as large and imposing as humans. But slowly, as they saw how carefully the humans handled them, and how gently they spoke, and how concerned they were for Pelin, well-being, the fear began to fade. One of the Pelin survivors approached Jake as he was reviewing a damage report with Ryan. The translator identified her as Captain Lyra, who had been the master of the Bright Wing before it was torn apart by pirates. "Captain Morrison, on behalf of my crew and all my passengers, I must thank you because you saved us when we had completely given up any hope of rescue." Jake shook his head and his voice was gentle. "You do not need to thank us, Captain Lyra, because responding to a distress call is what anyone should do when they hear that people are in danger." Lyra's expression shifted to something strange that was part gratitude and part something else that Jake could not quite identify. "But that is exactly the point, Captain Morrison, because in this galaxy, most species would not respond, even if they heard the call." She paused and seemed to be choosing her words carefully. "The Corsath have been raiding this sector for many cycles, and we have sent distress calls before when other ships were attacked. Sometimes other vessels pass nearby, and sometimes they definitely hear our transmissions because we can detect their sensors scanning us. But they never come because they say the risk is too great, or they claim it is not their problem, or they insist they need authorization from their governments first. But you came without hesitation." Jake felt uncomfortable with the way she was looking at him, as if he had done something extraordinary, when all he had done was the obvious thing. "We heard that children were in danger, Captain Lyra, and what else could we possibly have done except come as fast as our ship could carry us?" Lyra stared at him for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that made Jake pay closer attention. "You asked what else you could have done. And most species in this galaxy would answer that question by saying they could have protected themselves by staying away. That is what makes you terrifying, Captain Morrison, because you and your kind come from a death world where everything tried to kill you for millions of years. You are apex predators by evolution, and by all logical accounts, you should be the most dangerous species that we have ever encountered in all our centuries of space travel. And yet when we needed help desperately, it was you who came to save us without counting the cost or calculating the risk." Jake did not know what to say to that, so he simply nodded and went back to coordinating the rescue efforts while thinking about her words. Around him, his crew continued their work with the same dedication they brought to every task, whether it was combat operations or saving lives. They were just doing their jobs as they saw it. But apparently to the rest of the galaxy, what they were doing looked like something else entirely. News of the rescue traveled through the galactic community with the speed that only truly shocking events could achieve in an age of instant communication across vast distances. The story was picked up by every major news network and debated in council chambers on 100 worlds and whispered in trading posts scattered across dozens of star systems. Ambassador Victoria Lane stood before the Galactic Council in the vast chamber that had witnessed countless debates over the millennia since its construction. She was humanity's representative among the stars, and she stood surrounded by delegates from species that had been traveling between worlds when humans were still learning to make fire. Counselor Vex of the Tholian Assembly addressed her, and his tone carried the kind of disdain that came easily to those who considered themselves superior. Ambassador Lane, your species has created a significant diplomatic incident through its reckless actions, and the Korsath clans are now demanding substantial reparations for the destruction of their vessels. Victoria's response was measured and cold as ice, despite the anger she felt building inside her chest. With all due respect, Counselor, those vessels were actively engaged in acts of piracy and murder against unarmed civilians, and our ship responded appropriately to a legitimate distress. Vex waved one appendage dismissively, as if swatting away an annoying insect. Nevertheless, you violated established neutral space protocols by entering without prior authorization, and you engaged in military action without seeking council approval first. He paused for effect before continuing. This is simply not how civilized species conduct themselves in the galactic community. Victoria leaned forward, and her voice carried clearly to every corner of the chamber. Let me be absolutely clear about humanity's position, Counselor Vex, because I want there to be no misunderstanding about where we stand. If you are suggesting that humanity should have ignored that distress call and should have allowed those civilians to die while we waited for council approval, then we fundamentally disagree on what the word civilization actually means. The council chamber erupted in murmurs and whispered conversations as delegates turned to each other to discuss this unprecedented statement. Counselor Kree of the Pellan Republic rose from her seat, and her voice shook with emotion that was unusual in the normally sedate council proceedings. This council debates protocols and procedures while the humans debate morality and basic decency. And my people owe our very lives to the crew of the Valiant. Whatever political games you wish to play, that truth remains solid and unchangeable. Victoria nodded respectfully to the Pellan counselor before addressing the chamber again. The human position is simple, and I will state it as clearly as possible so that it can be recorded in the official proceedings. We will always respond to distress calls when we are able, and we will always defend innocent civilians when they are threatened. If that makes us uncivilized in the eyes of this council, then so be it, but we will not apologize for saving lives back on Earth. The story had captured public imagination in a way that few galactic incidents had managed to do in the years since humanity joined the wider community. Major General Patrick Cole stood in a briefing room at Fleet Command Headquarters, presenting his analysis to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Admiral Catherine Sullivan listened carefully to his presentation before asking the question that everyone in the room was thinking. What are your recommendations? General Cole pulled up tactical assessments and deployment maps that showed the current state of human military assets in frontier space. We need to significantly increase our patrol presence in the frontier sectors, Admiral, because the Korsath are not the only pirate group operating in those regions. If we are going to make good on our commitment to respond to distress calls, then we need the ships and personnel in position to actually do it effectively. General Nathan Pierce nodded in agreement and added his own perspective. Agreed completely, but we also need to be smart about how we approach this, because we cannot fight everyone's battles for them. What we need are allies who will stand with us and share the burden of keeping the frontier safe. Admiral Sullivan considered both perspectives before making her decision. Then we make allies and we show them that humanity keeps its word, and authorization for increased patrols is approved effective immediately. She paused and then added with a slight smile, and someone get Captain Morrison a commendation, because his actions may have just bought humanity more goodwill than a decade of careful diplomatic efforts could have achieved. Meanwhile, in the darker corners of the galaxy, far from the light of civilization, the surviving Korsath captain delivered his report to the clan warlord. The warlord sat in silence as the captain described in detail the human ship's capabilities and its ruthless efficiency, and the cold fury of its commander. When the report was finished, the warlord's voice was a low growl, and you simply let them live and allowed them to send you away with a warning. The captain's response carried undertones of fear that he could not quite hide. My lord, with respect, You do not understand what we faced out there because their weapons and their tactics were unlike anything we have encountered before. They destroyed 2 of our ships in a matter of minutes as if we were nothing, and their captain wanted us to survive specifically to deliver a message and a warning to all our clans. Warlord leaned back in his seat and his expression became thoughtful rather than angry. Perhaps we have been hunting the wrong prey all this time, and these humans are more interesting than we initially thought. They come from a death world, do they? The captain nodded nervously. Yes, my lord, and everything about them reflects that origin. The warlord made his decision. Then we will see just how dangerous they truly are, but not yet, because we must be patient and clever. Spread the word among all. The clans that any vessel bearing human markings is to be avoided completely for now, but begin gathering information about them and learn their patterns and discover their weaknesses, because one day we will test their resolve properly. The captain bowed and left to carry out his orders while the warlord remained seated, thinking about these Deathworlders who had disrupted his carefully organized operations. Across the galaxy, the pieces were moving on a board that none of the players could fully see yet. Humanity had announced its presence and its values in the most dramatic way possible by showing that they would fight for others, even at cost to themselves. Some species saw this as nobility, while others saw it as dangerous unpredictability, and still others saw it as an opportunity or a threat depending on their own circumstances. But everyone agreed on one thing, which was that the galaxy had changed the moment the Valiant responded to that distress call. The Deathworlders had shown what they stood for, and now everyone had to decide how they would respond to that revelation. 6 months had passed since the Brightwing incident, and the galaxy had changed in ways that were both subtle and profound. Captain Jake Morrison sat in his quarters aboard the Valiant reading reports that came in from across human-controlled space and beyond. The Valiant had become something of a legend in those months, and with it humanity's reputation among the stars had evolved into something neither threatening nor weak, but rather something entirely new. They were no longer just the dangerous newcomers from a death world who everyone watched nervously at diplomatic functions. They had become known as the ones who answered the call when others would not. Sophie knocked on his door and entered when he called for her to come in. Captain, we have got another one. Jake looked up from his reports and set them aside. Another distress call. She nodded and pulled up the details on her datapad merchant vessel with Kralix registry, and they are under attack by pirates in the Outer Reaches sector. She paused before adding the most interesting detail. They are specifically requesting human assistance by name. Jake stood, and a grim smile crossed his face. Then we should not keep them waiting and sound general quarters, as the Valiant's crew rushed to their stations with the practiced efficiency born of months of similar responses. Jake took a moment to reflect on how far they had come. The galaxy had learned something important about humanity that day, 6 months ago when they responded to the Brightwing's desperate call. When someone sent out a distress call and when innocent lives hung in the balance, humans did not stop to calculate the political cost or weigh the diplomatic consequences. They did not debate protocols or wait for authorization from distant bureaucrats who would never face the consequences of delay. They simply came, and they came ready for whatever fight was necessary. The human fleet had grown substantially in those 6 months as more ships were commissioned and more crews were trained for rapid response operations. Dozens of vessels now patrolled the frontier sectors, creating a network of protection that had not existed before. Civilian vessels of all species had begun adding a simple phrase to their emergency protocols that spoke volumes about the change that had occurred. Request human assistance because word had spread, and everyone knew that humans took distress calls personally in a way that other species simply did not. Commander Greg Wallace had been newly promoted and now served aboard the Earth Defense Force Ship Defender, monitoring operations from Fleet Command. He watched the tactical displays that showed dozens of human ships scattered across the frontier like guardians watching over a flock. His communications officer looked up from her console with a satisfied expression. Sir, we are getting confirmed reports from across the frontier and pirate activity is down 40% in all sectors where we maintain regular patrol presence. Greg nodded with approval, but his expression remained serious. That is good news, but we need to stay vigilant because the pirates are not gone, just more cautious. They will test us again eventually, and we need to be ready when they do. Back on the Valiant. Katie worked her sensor console as they approached the coordinates of the distress call at maximum speed. Captain. I am reading the merchant vessel now, and there are 3 hostile contacts, but they are breaking off their attack. Ryan checked his tactical display and confirmed her report. Confirmed, Captain, and they are running at full speed. He paused and then added with something that might have been amusement. They must have detected our quantum signature and decided discretion was the better part. A Valor Jake allowed himself a slight smile. Good, and that saves us ammunition, and Sophie opened a channel to the merchant vessel and let them know they are safe now. When Sophie opened the communication channel, the Kralix captain's relief was almost palpable even through the translator human vessel. This is Captain Tor of the merchant ship Steady Prophet, and we cannot thank you enough. When we saw your quantum signature on our sensors, we knew immediately that we would survive this day. Jake responded, with genuine warmth. Captain Tor, this is Captain Jake Morrison of the Valiant, and are you and your crew unharmed? Minor damage to our hull plating. But yes, we are all fine thanks to your rapid response. Glad to hear it, and do you need an escort to your destination? That would be greatly appreciated, Captain Morrison, and if I may say, the entire galaxy is fortunate to have humanity watching over these dangerous regions. Jake glanced around his bridge at the young faces of his crew and the determination he saw there made him proud. We are just doing what is right, Captain Tor, and we are ready to move when you are. As the Valiant took up escort position alongside the merchant vessel, Jake thought about the path that lay ahead for humanity among the stars. The galaxy was vast and filled with dangers and wonders in measures that seemed almost equal. Humanity was still learning its place in this grand cosmic community and still figuring out who they wanted to be when measured against civilizations that had existed for thousands of years. But one thing had become absolutely certain through their actions over these past months. When someone sent out an SOS and when innocent lives were at stake, humanity would always respond without hesitation, because of political calculations or diplomatic strategies, and not because of treaties or alliances that had been carefully negotiated, but because somewhere deep in the human psyche was a truth that had been burned into their DNA through millions of years of evolution on a world that tried to kill them. You protect the pack and you answer the call, and you stand between the innocent and whatever darkness threatens them. The pirates and slavers of the galaxy were learning this lesson slowly, but surely. So were all those who preyed on the weak and thought that the vast distances of space would protect them from consequences. Humanity had arrived in the galactic community, and they had brought with them values forged in the crucible of their death-world courage that came from facing extinction and surviving, and compassion that grew from understanding what it meant to struggle. Most importantly, they brought an unshakable conviction that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the cost on Earth. Admiral Sullivan reviewed the latest reports from the frontier operations and signed off on another expansion of the patrol program. Her aide, Lieutenant Sam Carter, brought her yet another stack of requests. Admiral, we are now receiving requests for human patrol presence from 17 different sectors, and that is more than we currently have ships to cover effectively. Sullivan looked out at the stars visible through her office window and made her decision. Then we build more ships and we train more crews, because this is not just about military strategy anymore. Sam, this is about who we are as a species and what we stand for, and the galaxy is watching to see if we mean what we say. Back on the Valiant as they escorted the Kralix merchant to safety. Jake stood on the bridge watching the stars stream past. Somewhere out there in the vast darkness, another ship might be sending out a distress call at this very moment. Another crew might be fighting desperately for survival, and another group of innocents might be facing danger that they could not overcome alone. And when that call came through the communication channels, and when that moment arrived, humanity would be ready to respond, because the Deathworlders had arrived among the stars, and they had brought with them a simple philosophy that was changing everything. When someone calls for help, you answer, and you come ready to fight, and you take it personally. The galaxy would never be quite the same again.